Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Path of Exile 2 using the RX 9060 XT. The version of 9060 XT that we're using is the XFX Swift OC model of the card. It is a 16GB variant. It's also an MSRP variant. We're playing on the latest AMD drivers and pairing with the 9800X 3D as well as 64GB of DDR5. Just keep in mind, this is a powerful CPU pairing. I am planning on building out a more lower end system to more appropriately test some of these, mid to entry level GPUs. And this game is one that is known for being a little bit CPU demanding. So if you are pairing it with a weaker CPU, you may see some slight differences. It shouldn't be like life-changing differences, but there might be, 10-15% change in FPS depending on your CPU as you kind of ramp down the ladder. Let's hop in. So taking a look at our settings here, they're pretty simple. So we have a simple toggle here for dynamic resolution, bunch of different upscaling modes. Obviously, we'll be just, going for FSR if we do decide to use our upscaling here. No support for FSR 4 at this time. However, it does run on DirectX 12, so there is definitely a chance that that will come later down the road. This game is still in pre-release right now. So we're going to start off here at 1080p, not upscaled, so no dynamic resolution. The other thing I will mention that I really do like is that it actually just lets you change your render resolution. You can just change this however you want. This is a nice cheap easy option to change. It's kind of old school. A lot of games don't have it anymore. I do like the fact that that's still in here. As far as our graphic settings, we don't really have a ton. There's a few main ones that will kind of impact our performance. Main one here, texture quality, and then the next one is our lighting. These will be the two that will be the most demanding. Now we're going to leave this at high, which is default. And then for this one, for lighting, we'll also leave at shadow plus global illumination. Now for our global illumination actual quality, right now it's set to low. We're going to also put that at high. So these are basically just high settings right now. There's not a global preset to change things here. I don't mind that personally. Some games, it's kind of nice to have just something you can toggle on and off, switch around the settings as you're trying to get the frame rate right. For a game like this, you kind of just find your settings once and stick with them. You're not really going to be constantly changing them. So in this particular instance, I don't actually mind that it's a bit more detailed. We have number of lights, sun shadow, bloom, water detail, things like that could potentially impact our performance. But this is just basically just high settings at 1080p native. All right, so loaded in here, we are early game, so it is worth just kind of keeping that in mind. As we go later into the game, certainly things will become, more demanding, things like that, but just kind of give you a good indication of generally where we're at. You can see in the town here, this is a pretty demanding area, 1% low down at 60, our average at around 140, and as far as our graphics, they look totally great. We're using just about 6GB of video memory, and actually here at 1080p, at least so far, our CPU isn't really being utilized all that much. So we'll hop into our first little area here, do a little bit of combat. We'll of course restart counting here. I will say that the frame time graph is seeming to indicate that it's definitely choppier than it actually is. You can see jumping into a bit of combat here, not really any major issue. Now, this is a game that I have put about 50 or so hours into, so I'm well aware that it does get far, far more demanding as we go into late game, and there's a ton more effects. So I'll try my best. I am doing this kind of lightning arrow build that is pretty effects heavy to hopefully get some sort of indication, though nothing can really truly replicate how things look late game. But my character that I have that's a little later in the game is not on current season, so I didn't think it would be super relevant to show. I thought it might be better to show a current season character here. But as you can see, 150 FPS average, 1% lows down to 60. Generally a really, really smooth experience, and even, pushing on into the, some combat here, still not really super CPU demanding. So I don't know if that will maybe rear its head as you go later into the game. We may not see that at these early stages, but it doesn't seem like the 9800X 3D is really pulling that much weight anyways, so it's good to see that the pairing itself here doesn't seem to be that inappropriate for what we're trying to test here. But generally here, high settings, I don't really feel the need for any sort of like FSR, upscaling, anything like that. And at 1080p, typically you'd kind of want to avoid upscaling just because it doesn't look super great when you're just using 1080p, especially considering the fact that we don't have our machine learning version of that upscaling. You can see even in a boss here, really not dropping down all that much, or a boss, or whatever you want to call it, like a stronger enemy. We can go ahead and sprint, which is a new mechanic now in Path of Exile 2. Again, like loading in new areas. Nothing too demanding. So yeah, 1080p here on 9060 XT. Not that it should be super surprising, but Path of Exile 2, it's an action RPG, so it is a game that, you know, having high FPS, it's not necessarily going to be like super important, like talking like, you know, 200 FPS, but it is nice, especially when a lot of things are happening. You don't want slowdown, you know, making you like miss when you're needing to like use a particular skill or something like that. So seemingly really solid performance here. Is pulling quite a bit of wattage, right around 200 or so into the 170s, then sometimes spiking up here and there, but generally really solid performance. Now let's go ahead just to see here, and again, I don't want to use too much in terms of our upscaling here, so we'll just go for quality upscaling just to see if this gives us any like significant boost to our FPS. Really, the image looks quite a bit softer here, so I wouldn't really recommend using FSR in this title if you are already getting, you know, a decent frame rate, because honestly, the clarity of the picture being lost here is much more noticeable than the you know, slight gain. So in general here, you know, really solid performance at 1080p. Now, the only other thing to test here is just if we were to play with some settings, maybe bump them down to low or up higher to high, see what we can get. So let's actually just play with these a little bit to see if we can get these to take effect in game. Really, the only thing that we can really turn up seemingly is our shadow and GI quality. And honestly, even bumping those settings up doesn't seem to have a major impact on our performance. So it seems like it could potentially be a CPU bottleneck at this point, or maybe a GPU bottleneck. Even though we're not fully utilizing our GPU, it is high enough that there may be just, you know, slight optimization issues that are causing it to not be fully utilized. But in general here, sitting around 150 to 180 FPS at 1080p regardless of settings seems to be a really solid place in my opinion. All right, back on those same high settings, now at 1440p. Once again, this is native. So here at 1440p native, we are seeing a slight dip to our FPS, where we were getting like around 150 or so, 160, 170, 180, kind of in that neighborhood. Now we're seeing a dip down to about 120 or so, and that's even without any enemies or any effects or anything going on. So obviously pretty evident that we are, you know, obviously taxing the card. We're seeing full utilization from our GPU at this point, and our CPU utilization is actually awfully low. So it doesn't really seem like the 9800X3D is really like, you know, bringing us up anywhere. I'll go ahead and restart counting after that loading screen, but it doesn't really seem like the 9800X3D is really like, you know, propelling this card into a territory where, you know, it wouldn't otherwise be able to be at. So a little bit of combat here, not much. Sees another drop into the 110s. But in general here, you know, again, you know, I do have to say, you know, I'm familiar with, you know, some of the combat that you'll see in this game later on, and I am well aware that it does get quite a bit more demanding. So here's some effects. You know, you can see that drops us into the 70s even momentarily. So that is certainly something to keep in mind. While I wouldn't really mind necessarily just like being around the 100s, dropping into the 70s is and this isn't even like a super, you know, it's not even really like a very demanding encounter or anything. So that is certainly a bit concerning. And yeah, honestly, even like concerning enough to where I do think that at this point, if we did want to stick with these same settings, we may want to introduce a bit of upscaling. So Again, there's no like, global preset that we have available to us. So rather than changing our settings at this point, let's just actually go ahead and we'll go for FSR at quality. See if we can get into like a similar type of engagement and just see how our performance hangs on in that situation. Here you can see, where we were like around 120 or so. Now we're definitely a bit higher, so getting like closer to 140. A bit of combat here. Seas drops into the 130s. So, and honestly, now that we're at 1440p, the upscaling is really not, not super significant. Like FSR definitely works much better, even the older models, or I should say especially the older models, when we're at higher resolution. So playing at quality FSR 3 upscaling at 1440p will look considerably better than playing at quality FSR 3 upscaling at 1080p. So yeah, here running around again, no major like huge encounters or anything. Gonna try, maybe we can corral a bunch of enemies together, try to get somewhat of a intense scene, see if we can get the FPS to dip. Slight dip to the 120s, but yeah, in general still holding like really really strong here. So again, this is at high settings. Now we could obviously bump down settings. I don't personally see a need to. I mean, I think that, just using a little bit of upscaling seems to kind of help you get there in a bit of a different way. Here you can see like activating some things gives us slight dips, but even the dips that we're getting, rather than going into like the 70s, we're going to like the 110s and things like that. So definitely really serviceable performance at this point. All right, so now before we move on to 4K here, I do want to spend a little bit of time. I know there's not many settings, but I do want to try this ultra setting here. So moving up shadow and GI quality to ultra, which is really our main setting that we can change here as far as like increasing the settings. And you can just see, I'll go ahead and show here how demanding this is. Again, this is at native resolution, but just increasing that selection there to ultra, really makes it far more demanding. Now we're seeing 60 FPS, and this is just in the town. So if we hop into an area here, and let's go ahead and restart counting, we'll see if we can even hold a 60 FPS average with a bit of combat going on here. But I don't know if that global illumination, shadow quality, if it really makes like enough difference, in my opinion, to really warrant such a decrease in the FPS. But again, that's maybe something that you might want to look at with like side-by-side comparisons, as opposed to like a performance benchmark like we're showing here. But yeah, going down into the 60s, while this is certainly like still playable in my opinion, we're definitely losing out on a lot of performance. Now we are playing at native resolution, which again is really not necessary now that we're at 1440p. So we can certainly just use FSR at quality and probably reclaim a good bit of this FPS without really very noticeable picture degradation. The quality of the picture would likely be very similar. So, but at native resolution, you certainly can play 1440p here at our maxed out settings here without really I don't know, it's not really like major issue. You can see again our CPU utilization is not very high. It's only using just over 10% of our CPU. Here's like maybe a little bit more demanding of a scene. A lot of enemies coming in here. See just how low we can really get this to go here, down to the 50s temporarily. Really, even though it is certainly dipping here, I don't think it's like necessarily like the end of the world. I mean, it's actually dipping like consistently enough that I still find it to be like a relatively smooth experience. So it's just kind of interesting to see though just how demanding these settings actually are, or actually not even these settings, just this one particular setting with the lighting and the shadows and the global illumination. So it's something to keep in mind. Now of course, if you want to use these settings, the other thing that you can do is you can use our upscaling. So let's go ahead, we'll throw on FSR just to quality here. So FSR at quality again at let's just make sure that other setting's stuck. Yeah, it did. But again, FSR quality really at 1440p looks really solid. I mean, you may lose like a little bit of sharpness that we were seeing at native, but it's not super noticeable. And now, we're nearly doubling our FPS at this point. So where we were getting like right around, maybe not doubling, but pretty close, where we were getting like 60 or 70 FPS. Now we're seeing above 100, 111 on our average at this point. So it is definitely something that is worth, looking into, just throwing on FSR quality. Get a lot of the performance back, still get the really pretty looking visuals, and at 1440p, the upscaling is really not too severe. Like, it's not, going to result in a super terrible looking image. Go ahead and see if we can find a larger group of enemies like this, see if that drops us too much. Kind of sitting right around 100. Doesn't really seem like we dipped below 100 at any super consistent basis. But yeah, in general here, really solid performance at 1440p, and yeah, it's not a super demanding game. It is a game that you want high FPS in, so it's really up to you if you want good looking visuals here. And again, I'll mention one more time, but I know that these maps, as you get later into the late game and definitely in end game and post game when you're running maps, they can be very demanding, and you may even want to dump down settings a bit more. And before we leave 1440p, let's just go back on native here, and let's see if we just wanted maximum possible FPS here. As you can see, it's kind of respawning us here, but if we just kind of bump down all of our settings here down to low where possible, only thing leaving is our texture filtering. But going down to low here, I imagine this will bring us into a more CPU bound scenario. Which you can see now when our GPU utilization is dropped, but our FPS is still, capped to a certain degree. It seems to be indicative of a CPU bottleneck now. So, well, actually, I'm not 100% confident now that our GPU utilization is rising a little bit. Maybe it may depend on the particular scene, but here you can see, if you just wanted like maximum possible FPS. Honestly, the game does look better with higher settings, but if you're just running around and you're not really like looking to have like a really great looking game, you kind of just want to play, have good performance, and not deal with like any like annoying stutters or anything like that, you can certainly do that and bump down some settings and reclaim a bit of FPS here. So this is like essentially low settings. Again, there's not like a quick and convenient preset for us to select here, but you can also kind of get your FPS in this method. All right, now moving up to 4K, we're actually going to stick with the same settings that we last tested. So these are essentially low settings, quote unquote low settings. Some of them are low, some of them are medium, but these are the lowest settings that we have at native 4K resolution. So this is where I definitely don't expect our CPU to really play a factor whatsoever. So you can see we're 100% GPU utilized, very little CPU utilization, which is not super surprising at 4K, but it is nice to see, even at 4K native here, that at least running around to begin with here, we are seeing definitely playable FPS. Now these are, again, those low settings, but honestly, my opinion, this game doesn't even really like ever look that bad. Even at low settings, it's not like it's an ugly looking game. In fact, in my opinion, this looks better than Diablo even at low settings, but that's maybe just, it could be just more my preference for the art style. But as you can see, running around, still getting really solid FPS. Our 1% lows are at 60 FPS, which is already what I would consider to be, especially at 4K on a card that's really not meant to be a 4K card. That's what I would expect to be like, happy with performance wise. So definitely nice to see here. Now this is, of course, our lowest settings, which I don't know, I imagine a lot of people would be okay playing on low settings here if you're okay with the FPS, but definitely nice to see that, the 9060 XT, and it's not even using that much video memory at 4K here. So even if you had the 8GB model of the 9060 XT, I don't really think that you'd be running into very many video memory limitations. Like across the board, doesn't really seem like the game is really going to be using that much GPU memory or video memory. You can see some effects drop us into the 90s momentarily, but seems to recover pretty quickly, and in general, decent performance here, now down into the 80s. So while I'm not super confident that this will still be good or playable when we start increasing our settings, it is nice to see that, at least on low settings, we're able to make this work without too many compromises. So let's try bumping up some settings here. So let's go for the high texture detail. Shadows and global, we'll just leave this at high for now. That seemed to be pretty demanding. So these are essentially just our default settings. Really the only thing that's not default, I guess, is the shadow and GI quality. So I'll leave that. So these are our default settings, right? Now this is at 4K resolution. At native, no upscaling whatsoever. And definitely, even though that we don't have FSR 4, same thing like with 1440p, you know, using upscaling when we start going to 4K is going to result in some pretty great results, just due to the fact that our target resolution is so high. You know, it's not going to be really a major issue that we don't have FSR 4 in this case. So here, even with like a bit higher settings, and again, we're still native here, you can see we're seemingly getting 60 FPS most of the time. Some dips into the 50s with an average around 67 to begin with here. So overall, pretty decent performance here. I mean, you know, if you're playing at 4K, I do think this is a GPU that certainly can play at 4K a lot of games, and this seems to be one of them. It's just a matter of, you know, what kind of FPS do you want versus what kind of visuals are you okay with. And my personal opinion, you know, you're not really having to make too many compromises. I mean, we're here at, you know, high settings, 4K. The only thing that we haven't bumped up is our global illumination, which we may as well go ahead and bump up now. Set this on ultra here. You can see that drops us down a little bit more into the 50s now, but in general, you're still getting really solid performance. Now, if you wanted to get a bit more, of course, like I said, we do have our upscaling option. So if we throw on FSR, we can even go down to balanced here. And we should still be getting a pretty good looking picture. And honestly, kind of a bit surprised that this isn't increasing our FPS more, going down to balance. Now we are on that higher setting. In fact, let me just double check that that actually took effect. Yeah, that's interesting. Seemingly not really giving us a major increase to our FPS, so it may not, you know, thing about FSR 2 is it just changes the resolution at which you're, you know, rendering the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not still, you know, rendering the game at high detail. So when you increase some graphics presets, sometimes those become like the bottlenecks as opposed to just like the actual render resolution, especially on kind of like mid-range or entry-level cards like this. So I imagine that although we're not getting a major improvement here at our ultra setting with the FSR, I imagine that if we were to just bump this down, let's say if we were to go back just to our default settings, so we can call it like these are high settings, this is where you do start to see that FPS begin to rise. So now we're getting around 100 with balanced FSR, which I probably want to go too much lower than balanced personally, though I will show the other settings just because, well, you know, it's if you look closely, I can tell that it is certainly being upscaled and it's not super sharp. If I was just like running around playing the game, I don't think it would bother me necessarily, but I imagine going down further might result in a bit of a kind of muddy image that I would actually be able to actually notice the difference. So this is at our high settings. Now, the last thing I do want to test before we kind of going a bit out of order here, but if we were just bump down everything to low and use that balanced preset, which even though we're at 4K, I don't really want to go too far beyond balanced. But here at the low settings, balanced preset, here you can see we're getting, you know, really, really solid FPS, 140 or so. And here we have some more enemies here. We'll go ahead and gauge, see if we can get it to drop to a super meaningful degree. And seems like even here it drops all the way down to 80s, into the 80s temporarily. Not like game breaking, and honestly I will say that the FPS seemed to like drop and climb at a consistent enough rate that it actually wasn't like super terrible, like super noticeable or anything like that. So that, you know, it's kind of a good thing, I think. But in general here, you know, not necessarily where I'd recommend playing at. I think that you can kind of get this performance at some other ways, but this is certainly, I can see people playing on the low settings. I do think the game actually still looks very good even on low settings. So just to circle back, I'm going completely out of order here, but let's go ahead, and so we're on the lowest settings here. If we did just want to go ultra performance, so this is the highest level of upscaling here, this is where you can start to see our CPU is kind of what's pulling ahead. So this is now where our GPU is kind of like hit its limit essentially, and now we're just kind of like waiting on our CPU. So even though we're only at 16% CPU utilization, does seem to be that we are in a CPU bound place right now, even on a 9800X 3D. So being CPU bound is not really something that we want to do. Let's leave it here at ultra performance, and let's see with ultra performance if we just bump everything up to high. Again, I'm going completely out of order here. I apologize. There will be, of course, like there always is, kind of pointless at this point to mention it, but always, you know, chapter markers for you to help guide yourself. But here at max settings, ultra performance is also another way to kind of get that same level of performance. So I will say, yeah, the FSR of it all, the fact that we are on a bit of an older model of FSR is certainly noticeable. You know, definitely like even like some effects like this, I am definitely noticing like quite a bit of like ugly visual artifacting. So it's something to keep in mind. You know, if that sort of thing bothers you, it's certainly I don't want that to come up. Whoops. But if that sort of thing bothers you, I definitely think that, you know, these particular settings might not be your cup of tea. But if you just wanted to play, you know, max settings and maybe, I don't know, maybe your eyesight wasn't so good and you can't really tell the blurriness, you can use this ultra performance mode and, you know, get that FPS back. And you can see even like in like a big effect boss encounter like this, able to play through at a really consistent frame rate, averaging 111. So definitely have options available for you here. Anyways, guys, that's been it for Path of Exile 2 on the RX 9060 XT. Overall, it's not a very demanding game. It is a really great looking game. It is CPU heavy though, so a lot of your performance will be dependent on your CPU, but of course, mostly your GPU. You will have to have a GPU to drive it, and the 9060 XT, once again, it kind of, you know, this card always kind of impressed me, and really, it's really impressive, especially for the price point, really impressive at 1080p and 1440p, and then you kind of have to stretch it to get it to be where you want to at 4K, but it's certainly serviceable, and you can make it work so long as you're not too picky about, you know, the particulars when it comes to, you know, FSR, especially FSR 4, just due to the fact that it's not widely available across all games yet without the use of like some, you know, external tools like optiscalers. So, you know, if you're okay with using those things or tweaking some settings, you're going to be having a really, really solid experience. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next one. Bye-bye.